Chapter 4. Living the Dream. It's amazing how quickly the turnaround of morale in a military unit can occur. For the men of No. 4 Company, this came directly as a result of the leadership from our new company commander, Major Charlie Knaggs, and his company sergeant, Major Ray Collister. Both of these men were natural leaders, and they both had a relaxed temperament about them, which made them approachable. Unlike most of their peers at the time, they were competent and gained the respect of their men through leadership and ability, rather than fear, violence, and bullying. These were the first two inspirational soldiers I had the pleasure of working under, and they genuinely cared about the men under their command. Under their leadership of No. 4 Company, the bad eggs were weeded out, and we gradually became a family and an effective fighting unit. My first encounter with Major Knaggs was on the rugby field. Well, a few of us were actually just casually playing rugby with a water bottle after an exercise session, and he had decided to join in. I remember hitting him hard in a tackle and was in shock at his response as he threw several punches at me, then wanted to throw down. The man was a lunatic. Knaggsy wasn't afraid to get down and dirty with the men, and this earned him instant respect. He also took the time to learn about all of his soldiers' families, and he understood the importance of morale. Like Napoleon, Knaggsy recognized the importance of high morale to the fighting troops. Napoleon was convinced that the high morale made the men under his command fight 3 times as hard, and in Knaggsy's case, even more so. In fact, we would have run through walls for Knaggsy, and would have confidently followed him through the gates of hell, as he was the finest commander I have ever served under. When he took command of No. 4 Company, the company was fractured, and we were pending a battalion move to Germany. But things were about to change, and for the better. I would use Knaggsy's compassion and leadership lessons later on in my career, when I was a commander myself. But regrettably, I witnessed very few officers at his level who shared his attributes and compassion throughout my career. Once the Irish Guards moved to Germany, we would all have to be retrained to facilitate our new job roles as armoury infantry. For the first 5 years, we would be stationed at Oxford Barracks in Munster, and these were some of the best times in my military career. Initially, all of the soldiers would have to complete Warrior Armoured Fighting Vehicle familiarisation, or crew conversion training. For me, this meant that I would be trained as a Warrior Driver Commander and be responsible for the maintenance and tactical manoeuvring of a 26-ton vehicle with a Rolls-Royce Perkins 17.4-litre air-cooled turbocharged engine. As we were No. 4 Company, all of our vehicles began with the letter D. Therefore, my Warrior was named Dongle, radio call sign 11. I can even remember the number plate, 35 kg 46. As this tracked armoured monstrosity was essentially my first car. But this was a car with caterpillar tracks instead of wheels, with an accompanying 30mm cannon and 7.62mm chain gun as added extras. 10 platoon would be allocated 4 warriors, and we were split into 2 daily working groups. The vehicle crews, which consisted of the drivers, gunners and commanders, were responsible for the maintenance and daily upkeep of the vehicles. The infantry dismounts were known as blades or foxhounds, and each warrior would have an infantry section of 7 blades allocated to them. Their daily training would consist mainly of infantry versus tank training, as our training methods were still focused on a Soviet invasion of the West. Most days we would finish work at 13:30 hours, and we would be able to have plenty of downtime to relax. I would work hard on my fitness, and often completed 3 exercise sessions a day before joining in with the platoon antics. I would share a room with Frank, and we soon became best friends. Frank had always had career ambitions and was quite serious, where I was more the platoon clown. On paper, our friendship shouldn't have worked. But at least at work, I was professional, and we had always had mutual respect for each other on the fitness front. Even to this day, we argue who was the fittest. And despite the fact that I am now classed as physically disabled, in my mind, I still believe I could beat him. I would routinely come up with bad ideas that would usually end up with us in trouble, whereas Frank tried to at least be by the book. We were both overly keen soldiers, and Frank would be rewarded for his hard work by being promoted to the rank of Lance Corporal after successfully completing his junior non-commissioned officers cadre, along with Niall. I was pleased for both of them, but I was happy being one of the lads and having no responsibility, apart from the maintenance of my 26-ton armoured car, that is. Frank often spoke about his plans to climb the ranks and even fancied himself as a future regimental sergeant major. My ambition back then, at least, went as far as the weekend and the future planning of the next platoon block party. These ranged from toga to Vietnam-themed and were usually out of control. The weekends were wild, to say the least, with these very block parties and the supplementary shenanigans that one would expect from a frat house. Then again, this was exactly what we were, as our company lines where we lived became extremely territorial and isolated from other members of the battalion. This did have a positive outcome, as it made us closer as brothers, which in turn made us a more effective fighting unit. We were young men, based in the centre of Europe, and it was not uncommon to play map roulette at the weekends and just head off to explore a random city. The pound was strong against the Deutschmark, and we seemed to have endless amounts of disposable income, which made our time in Germany even more enjoyable. This was the adventure that I had been sold by my recruiting sergeant, and I was finally enjoying life in the army, despite my bumpy start. Furthermore, the strong leadership from the senior level of No. 4 Company had positively stemmed its way through the command element to the benefit of all the Guardsmen, as I felt valued and trusted our leaders. Most of our Wednesday afternoons were spent at the large Azzi Park in the centre of Munster, playing sports. Additionally, we would frequently form up in our combat fatigues with large packs on our backs and head out on a high-intensity combat march, only to make our way to Azzi. However, our backpacks more than often contained beer, footballs, boom boxes, and civilian sportswear. European culture, especially the acceptance of nudity, fascinated us. We were all red-blooded young men after all. Women would frequently sunbathe topless in the Azzi Park, so naturally our footballs would always be accidentally kicked in their direction. Then there were the naked saunas. This was my first life lesson about the realization of fantasy versus reality. On our first and only trip to a German sauna, we had all imagined that it would be crammed with young, sexy, naked German girls, whereas the reality was that it was just us, and old, fat German men. Regardless, I was 19 years old and living my life to the full, but I never returned to that sauna again. Later that year, we were deployed to Canada for a culmination exercise at the British Army Training Unit Suffield, Bathurst, in Alberta. Bathurst was a vast training area where we could war game and put all our training to the test. This would determine if the Irish Guards as a battalion were fit to deploy on combat operations as armoured infantry and was a test that we needed to pass. The vehicle's crews had become very close in the past year, and my gunner, Soldier B, shared a special bond that made us a formidable crew. We could anticipate each other's combat decisions as a result of repetitive training and our friendship. On top of this, he was an exceptional gunner, and we had trust in each other's ability. Midway through the exercise, a turret malfunction crushed the legs of our popular and experienced vehicle commander, OD, and he would have to be replaced by a very inexperienced second lieutenant. Mr. Ormerod was fresh out of the factory and had not yet even completed any warrior conversion courses yet. But because myself and Soldier B had a reputation for being, if I'm being honest, exceptional, we were given a babysitting role that we would in no way exploit. Maybe we were slightly arrogant. But I would only take commands from Soldier B, to the dissatisfaction and frustration of Mr. Ormerod. We were just two teenage guardsmen, the lowest rank in the British Army. But as a warrior crew, despite our limited experience, we thought that we outranked a junior officer, as he had none. On this particular exercise, I vividly recollect that we were liaising with battalion headquarters, which was several kilometres away, and on our return journey, we had new orders for No. 4 Company. Soldier B was encouraging me to go faster, and I needed very little encouragement to put my boot to the floor. Mr. Ormerod pleaded with me to slow down, but Soldier B was insistent that we could increase the speed. Warriors have a top speed cross-country of around 30 miles per hour, but this one was like a race car, as the engine limiter must have come loose. So I increased the pace, and we approached a huge artillery crater. It was too late to slow down, and time began to come to a standstill as this 26-ton mini-tank became airborne. In the seconds that we were in flight, I panicked and attempted to, ineffectually, fasten my seat harness, as I knew this emergency landing was going to be painful. Our warrior came to an immediate, violent stop, and the force of the impact created a cloud of dust around us. Soldier B and Mr. Ormerod were only bruised, but not badly, just what is commonly referred to as turret rash, and my own head had been wedged in between my viewing port and my entry hatch. There is a reason for why we wear helmets. As the dust settled around us, there was a prominent silhouette of a man on the other side of the crater observing us, and he had clearly witnessed our irresponsible feat. As he approached, I exited the vehicle to check the damage, and to my disbelief, both of my tank caterpillar tracks were still intact. As the figure advanced towards us, by his gait, I recognized it was our company commander, Major Nags, and I could tell just by his body language he was not pleased. Nagsy calmly asked who my commander was, then just as calmly asked Mr. Ormerod to have a private word with him at the back of the vehicle. Let's just say that words were said, and ironically, Nagsy then called Soldier B and I to the front of the vehicle and ordered us not to take commands from Mr. Ormerod any more, and that Soldier B was in charge of our warrior. Both of us kept quiet and let Mr. Ormerod take the fall. Integrity was one of our core values, but neither of us wanted to disappoint Nagsy, so we kept quiet. The 6-week exercise would be brought to a halt with the untimely and upsetting death of Guardsman Connor Lilly, who would be killed when a Land Rover lost control on the dangerous gravel of Rattlesnake Road that accessed the prairie. I always remember that the Army flew Guardsman Lilly's family out to Canada, and this gave me great confidence in the British Army's welfare policy. With the risk assessment of such exercises, it is accepted that deaths can and will occur, and, in some cases, it would take up to 6 deaths for certain training exercises to be halted altogether. It was at this time that Major Naggs spoke to me about the prospect of attending my own junior non-commissioned officer cadre. To his bemusement, I declined, as I was happy with just being a guardsman. But Naggsy wasn't the type of commander you said no to, and none of the men under his command, including myself, wanted to disappoint him. That was it then. I was now reluctantly on the next course for promotion. Once we had completed the exercise in Batus, we were required to hand over our armoured vehicles in the same condition as we had received them. For our crew, we had an uphill battle, as we had damaged several road wheels on the Caterpillar tracks as a result of our airborne antics. It would be 48 hours before replacement parts would be available, and we were all desperate to experience the Canadian nightlife. However, we were not permitted to leave camp until our vehicles were sufficiently repaired. Consequently, due to our impatience, it was suggested by one of our sergeants that I acquire these road wheels from one of the permanent staff's vehicles that were in the adjacent hangar close by. I remember that I was just unscrewing a second road wheel when I was foiled and sent to jail for disciplinary action. In true Guards fashion, before I was charged with theft, I would be rigorously marched to jail in the camp's guard room. My best pal, Frank, had recently been promoted to the rank of Lance Corporal and was ironically tasked with locking me up. Unfortunately for me, the guard room where the cells were located was over a mile away from the vehicle park, and Frank would have to put our friendship aside and perform his military duties by rigorously marching me to the jailhouse. Initially, this was comical, as we were having some good banter between us. But after a few falls on the ice in the sub-zero Canadian temperatures, my outlook began to differ. Then, to my disappointment, when we arrived at the guard room, we were informed that they had no cells for me to be put in. So then, like a Benny Hill sketch, I was marched at the same rigorous pace back to the vehicle park for further instructions. At this point, I'd had enough, and I could have easily just mentioned that I was following orders from my sergeant. But instead, I asked what the charges were. Once I was informed that I would be charged with theft, I merely pointed out that I was taking one item of military property and relocating it to another location. This enraged the senior commander, who had wanted me formally charged. Then, fortunately, my company sergeant major appeared and suggested that as no formal charges could be pursued, as this wasn't technically theft, he would discipline me in-house. My punishment would be kept from my permanent military record, and I would be required to complete company fatigues for the following week, whilst the rest of my friends partied in the vibrant town of Medicine Hat. There were several such incidents throughout my career where I narrowly avoided being formally charged, whereas Frank was never so fortunate. My luck would ensure that after 15 years' service, I would be presented with my long service and good conduct medals, to everyone's, including Frank's, disbelief. The crime, as they say, was getting caught, and in my case, getting formally charged. Although I often joke with Frank about him missing out on this medal, he would argue that jailing a thief, his best friend, was a worthy substitute. It was in Canada that I would be introduced to the skiing world. All of the soldiers had the choice to either spend 7 days rest and recuperation, R&R, at the tourist city of Edmonton, or participate in a week's adventure training. This was a no-brainer for me and Frank, as both of us had joined the army for adventure, and we were currently living that dream. I received a quick starter course at the Olympic Ski Park in Calgary, before heading to the Sunshine Village ski resort in Banff. The staff had even opened the resort 4 days early to accommodate us, so we had the mountain to ourselves. Soldiers are fearless, and a good example of this is when I unintentionally skied off a small cliff. Bizarrely, and like lemmings, I was followed by Frank and Soldier B. We were all novice skiers, but would attempt the advanced black runs, and our fearlessness would more often than not end up with us painfully hugging trees. Then, once we were joined by the public, we were intentionally using them to stop. In hindsight, this was probably why they opened the resort early for us, as once we were joined by the public, it was mayhem. I would continue to ski throughout my career, and this was just one of the many perks of being a soldier in the British Army. On our return to Germany, rumours began to circulate about ethnic cleansing and acts of genocide that were happening in Europe. We were all aware of the breakup of the former Yugoslavia due to the United Nations, UN, intervention in Bosnia, but none of us was aware of the region known as Kosovo. We were informed about the 250,000 Albanians that were being forced from their homes by Serbian soldiers, and this was well documented and hyped up by the press. Just before Christmas leave, the tempo and excitement began to grow as our deployment readiness was increased. Frank, Soldier B and I were super excited at the prospect of going to war. As we were young men who were blinded by the romantic prospect of combat. We were young and naive, but had joined the army for adventure and excitement, and throughout 1998 we were not disappointed, as the army had delivered. We were overly eager to test our skills, our tradecraft, and especially to put our newly acquired armoured warfare training to the test. My promotion course was put on hold, but I didn't mind, as the prospect and glory of warfare superseded any career ambitions. On return to Oxford Barracks in the early January of 1999, the operational readiness was significantly increased again, but unfortunately, all of the readiness was prioritised towards No. 1 Company. To my frustration, they would deploy in Macedonia in the February and come under the command of the King's Royal Hussars battle group. No. 4 Company would lead the Irish Guards commanded battle group, and to my frustration, we would have to wait slightly longer for our operational deployment orders. Whilst we eagerly awaited to deploy, we would continue to train hard, but we would equally party as hard. One would automatically conclude that our off-duty shenanigans would be put on hold due to our imminent deployment. But this was far from the case. The weekends were still frenzied, and when looking back, the added enthusiasm of a war in Kosovo may have made us much worse. The regimental police and the barrack guard were regularly called to our lines to put an end to our block parties, and were often met with violent resistance. I don't recall any fear or apprehension about the prospect of going to war, but maybe subconsciously, this was just our way of coping with this pressure, as we were all clearly acting out. Come Monday mornings, we were all professional and performed our duties admirably. But on the weekends, we were feral. I remember in the following years that Frank and I witnessed a fridge seemingly fall from the sky from one of the downstairs windows of the 4 Company lines. Then moments later, 2 of the most unexpected and unlikely soldiers, Pez and Greenie, chased it down the stairs to retrieve their beers that were still inside. This was not out of the ordinary, as it was classed as normal behaviour and was accepted as long as everything was back to normal come Monday. At the time, Kosovo was a prominent Albanian region of Serbia, which had a deep and complex history regarding its autonomy and identity. By the mid-1990s, a guerrilla campaign was established by the Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, and was well underway. This was a direct result of Albanian leaders declaring independence, a rise in ethnic tensions and civil unrest. Tensions further increased in the March of 1998, when Serb forces rolled into the Kosovan village of Prekaz, using tanks and armoured personnel carriers. The target was the family of Adem Jesari, the founder of the KLA, and the house was levelled, killing all inside. 57 members of the Jesari family in total. The Prekaz massacre was reported by the world's media and changed international opinion, especially regarding the KLA as a terrorist organisation. The KLA made good use of the multimedia advances, such as the Internet, to successfully report their persecution, and this gained them more international support over the Serbs. The murder of the Jesari family had also inspired thousands of young Albanians who had rallied to join the ranks of the KLA, and this unfortunately incited further Serbian acts of genocide. In January 1999, more massacres were reported outside the village of Rakak, when 45 Albanians were found dead after another Serb attack. The UN feared a repeat of Bosnia and the atrocities that could have been prevented there with more decisive military interventions, such as the Srebrenica massacre. There was still one main obstacle to overcome, and that was that Serbia had the support from Moscow, and this only raised international tensions further, with the terrifying prospect of an all-out war with Russia. After the peace talks had stalled between Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic and the UN to halt the ethnic cleansing of the Albanians, diplomacy had fundamentally failed. So as a result, military action was authorized. After all, war is essentially an extension of diplomatic failure. In the March, an air campaign began to target military and strategic targets in Belgrade to put additional pressure on Milosevic. Then, in the May, and after months of frustration, we would finally get the call to deploy, but not before up-armouring our Warrior armoured fighting vehicles with additional Chobham armour. This was when I realised that I was driving a bullet magnet and questioned the need for further armour. We finished by spraying KFOR on our vehicles, which was short for Kosovo Peace Implementation Force, before they were shipped out, to be ferried by sea to the Greek port of Thessalonica. We would come under the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which was basically the sword to the UN's shield, which implied that we were going to war. My excitement outweighed any fear or doubts for that matter, as I was young, full of beans, and fully engrossed with the romanticism that is associated with warfare. Like many of my military brothers, I was more than willing to make the ultimate sacrifice, as I believed in what we were doing, and would happily welcome an honourable death on the battlefield. After a short stay in Greece, we travelled to Petrovac in Macedonia and began the final phase of our training. I was genuinely concerned, not afraid, about my warrior being immobilized and not being able to influence the fight. Therefore, I had anticipated that if such an event actually occurred, I would dismount and continue to fight on foot as an infantry soldier. As a result of this potentially happening, at every given opportunity, I would make use of what we had on the vehicle to use as a makeshift gym. I would run to and from the vehicle park, which was now a dust bowl, as a high level of fitness is a prerequisite of a capable infanteer. I would train hard with fellow Guardsmen, Dale McCallum. Dale would later transfer to the Scots Guards and was sadly killed by small arms fire in the Lashkar Gah district of Helmand province in 2010. When I knew Dale, he was so full of life, and one of those guys that everyone took an instant liking to. The sad thing is that within the military machine, people are moved on so frequently that you often lose touch with them, and this would be the case with Dale. I value the limited time we spent together, and always remember him for his warm smile. Regrettably, he wouldn't be the only one of my military brothers to fall in battle. But being a realist, this is just an accepted consequence of life as a soldier. 10 Platoon was appointed a new platoon sergeant in Wade, who had just been posted in, and as such, Wade had little experience in armoured warfare. He was appointed our vehicle commander, and it was up to Soldier B and I to get him up to speed. Wade was a really good guy, despite being a Manchester United fan. He had a soft Northern Irish accent and was straight down the line and by the book. I would learn a lot from Wade, and he became a role model for many of the Guardsmen in 10 Platoon who went on to have extraordinary military careers. Our platoon commander, on the other hand, well, that's a different story altogether. He lacked experience, and even forgot his own Bergen, large backpack, after taking it off to rest on a night patrol when training in Petrovic. Come on, these backpacks are massive. It's not like losing a set of keys. The only downtime that we ever experienced in the forest camp of Petrovic was in a small tent which housed an even smaller TV. Fortunately for us, one of the channels played British football, and it was rigged with the sound from BBC Sport from a separate radio, and this enabled us to watch big games. I only attended this tent once, as it was often inundated with senior ranks, and we Guardsmen never felt comfortable there. The highlight for myself was being able to watch the Division 2 playoff final between my beloved Manchester City and Gillingham on the 23rd of May. Mank Evans, John Cochran and I were all good buddies, and we had a lot in common. We were all Manchester City fans, all from Manchester, and were all in the Irish Guards. Mank Evans and I were in 10 Platoon, whereas John was in the reconnaissance platoon, but we never held that against him. After 90 minutes, the tent had emptied, as City were 2-0 down, and I was the only one left when Kevin Horlock scored. John quickly returned to the tent, and to our disbelief, City scored again in the 95th minute to equalise, and we went on to win on penalties. That night we got drunk with a bottle of ouzo that I had smuggled in from Greece, but instantly regretted it the following day, as I was on the ranges in the scorching Macedonian sun. Rumours did circulate about 3 men streaking that night, but nothing was ever proved, and the culprits still remain at large. Occasionally we would be tasked to patrol the mountains to the north, bordering the region of Kosovo, and we had a front-row seat to watch the ongoing bombing campaign against the Serbian military and strategic targets. These mountains were a sight of natural beauty, and I remember watching the most stunning sunset from this elevated location before the main event, which would be observing the Allied bombing of Serb military targets in the distance. A US F-117 stealth fighter had previously been shot down by a Russian SA-3 Goa surface-to-air missile, and this only made these border patrols more intense, as these planes were supposed to be hidden from radar. These patrols never frightened me, and throughout my time in Macedonia, I don't recall any of our platoon being afraid for that matter. We were well trained, and we were actually looking forward to finally being able to put our training to the test. By early June, our training was stepped up, and we began more aggressive drills such as bayonet fighting. Every man went through this, even the vehicle crews, and this prepared us psychologically to kill the enemy, and, let us not forget, to dehumanize them. We were preparing for war, and this is what our training always consisted of. It was physically brutal, as the ethos at the time was to train hard, to fight easy. I remember that no training was conducted to provide any form of humanitarian relief, and little language training was provided, as we were all allocated interpreters. Everything was now conducted at a high-tempo pace, with the focus being on aggression, fighting through, and different ways of killing the enemy. I recall that we were all pumped, wound up, and ready to be unleashed. We were dogs of war. We were ready, well-trained, drilled, and mentally focused for the battle to come. Our mission and training were primarily focused on defeating the Serbian forces in the region of Kosovo. We had been training aggressively for this, and when the mission began to change to a more peacekeeping task, all of us felt a sense of underwhelming disappointment. We were all young men who had undergone years of behavioral training, conditioning to go to war, to defeat the evil enemy. We wholeheartedly believed that we were the good guys, and were willing to participate in aggressive military action, as we all undoubtedly believed in our mission to save the Kosovo people. We'd been given daily briefs on the ethnic cleansing, and one must remember that we were still living in a bipolar world, where the remnants and scars of the Cold War were still at large. There was still a great deal of international tension, and a distinct lack of trust between East and West, and the Kosovo crisis could quite easily have been the powder keg to start another war. We received our orders to deploy into Kosovo on the morning of the 12th of June, and after months of preparations, we were moved from the cover of the Petrovic woods and leaguered up into neat military columns. I recall being in awe of the military might that was now on show, and that the air was swarming with helicopters. This was a multinational operation, and we were the main effort to secure the roundabout at the southeastern access point to Pristina, but were starting at the rear. The plan was to peel in, so that we would be fresh from any fighting once we arrived on the outskirts of the Kosovo capital. Once we were in position, we received a motivational speech from our commanding officer, before having a battalion blessing from the Padre. I found this prayer before battle quite hypocritical, as many soldiers who rarely took religion seriously were now praying because their lives were in imminent danger. Some soldiers were only religious in times of need, which was a concept that I couldn't really buy into. Our route was to drive along the E65 Macedonian highway into Pristina, and we were greeted with Albanian refugees as we passed through Skopje, waving us on and supporting us from the side of the road and on bridges. This gave us enormous pride and added purpose. We had a wealth of operational experience within the platoon that ranged from the 1991 Gulf War and Bosnia to Northern Ireland. But none of us had ever experienced anything like this. As we left Macedonia and entered the Serbian Kakanic Gorge, a mountainous valley, our armoured columns suddenly felt extremely vulnerable. Fortunately, we had elite soldiers from the Parachute Regiment and the Royal Gurkha Rifles flown in by helicopters to provide flank protection for our armoured vehicles. We were constantly delayed by Serbian mines and obstacles that had to be cleared by the Royal Engineers, and this was a very tense time, as we were static and open to attack. It was 15-30 hours by the time we finally passed through the potentially lethal Kakanic Gorge, and I was relieved. The tunnels were crumbling from the inside and had no light, whereas the bridges barely forded the weight of the armoured vehicles. It was a feat in itself just to get the armour along this decaying and dangerous mountainous route. In fact, the Royal Engineers had to build several bridges for us to use, as the current ones were not sufficient or safe enough for our heavy vehicles. If we had been forced to fight our way through this valley, then we would have taken an immense number of casualties, and if defended properly, then possibly we would have not made it at all. I wrote in my diary that I had hoped to have entered Kosovo aggressively with Serbian resistance, but after seeing the landscape, the reality of this made me cold and shiver. I wrote that I was relieved that we were entering as a peacekeeping force due to the nature of this landscape. As we entered the former Yugoslavia, there was an eerie ambience, as there was no signs of life in the neighbouring villages and towns. Cars were burnt out, and buildings demolished. What had happened here? As the ground levelled out, we were fast approaching our goal, Pristina, which was now only 50 kilometres away, when the heavens opened. This was not just any rain, but a tropical thunderstorm, which reduced our visibility and resulted in the convoy slowing down. About 30 kilometres out, the convoy came to a halt as the 3rd section in 10 platoon, Warrior call sign 1-3, had crashed into a truck. However, this wasn't just any truck, but a Serb military truck, full of landmines. The truck swayed off the road and crashed with the impact from the armoured Warrior. Then all of the occupants, Serbian soldiers, fled in fear for their lives. All of our infantry dismounted, but not before they were reminded not to stray off the hard standing of the road because of the danger of landmines. The irony, it would seem, that nowhere was safe from the Serbian mines. Just after 2200 hours, we received new orders to go firm for the evening. It seemed as if our mission parameters were changing hourly. The plan now was to take Pristina the following morning at first light. We were only 20 kilometres away, and we could visibly observe the lights of the capital in the distance. Throughout the night, Serbian forces would pass us, heading north with the occasional T-54-55 main battle tank aiming its cannon at us. If one single soldier lost their nerve and engaged these forces, then it would have started an all-out war. Thankfully, and despite the tension, we all kept our cool. In my diary, I noted that these military convoys were also accompanied by civilian vehicles from some of the Serbian population. These civilians were fearful of repercussions from the returning Albanians, as well as from us NATO soldiers, and sought refuge within mainland Serbia. Our interpreter explained that the Serbian-affiliated population of Pristina had evacuated the city the previous day, and at the time, I didn't really understand why. But in the following months, it would become all too clear. After breakfast on the 13th of June, we mounted up and drove at speed to Pristina, only to be halted by some Italians who were blocking our advance. The radio was filled with slightly racist phrases, such as, "Get these fucking spaghetti eaters out of the road," as our goal was to be the first into Pristina, and the race was on. When we arrived at our roundabout, the 3 platoons of No. 4 Company tactically manoeuvred into our pre-planned and rehearsed positions in all-round defence and secured the large roundabout at the southern entrance to Pristina. We were surrounded by the world's press. They'd been there waiting for us since the previous day, but the heavy rain had delayed our advance. This didn't really seem like an aggressive land advance if the press were already waiting for us. But we still had a job to do, and there was still danger lurking everywhere. Then the plan changed yet again. Our company commander screamed on the radio for us to withdraw, as the city had not been cleared for entry, and that we shouldn't have secured the roundabout. Most units who were involved in the liberation of Kosovo will take credit and boast that they were the first NATO forces into Pristina. I'm not bold enough to make such a claim, but the men of No. 4 Company were certainly in contention for such a military accolade. We withdrew to the outskirts of the city. The company commander gave us all a brief in person, informing us that the situation was continuously evolving. Our new orders were to secure the main supply route through Pristina. However, by now, some of the withdrawing Serbian forces were becoming aggressive and were attempting to antagonize us by firing small arms wildly at us in our general direction. We were now informed that our mission was to force the Serb forces out of Pristina and to secure Kosovo for its future people.